All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour, where the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has lashed out at the NATO military alliance after the military alliance rejected Ukraine's request to impose a no-fly zone to halt Russia's bombings. The NATO has cited further Russian aggression as the reason for its decision. However, NATO has warned Russian President Vladimir Putin of fresh sanctions if he does not stop the war. Now, Zelensky has accused the alliance of holding a very weak and a very confused summit.
Сьогодні відбувся саміт НАТО. Слабкий саміт, розгублений саміт. Саміт, на якому видно, що не всі вважають боротьбу за свободу для Європи метою номер один. 9 днів ми бачимо жорстку війну. Руйнують наші міста, обстрілюють наших людей, наших дітей, житлові квартали, церкви, школи, знищують все, що забезпечує нормальне життя, людське життя. І хочуть це продовжувати, знаючи, що нові удари і жертви неминучі. НАТО свідомо ухвалили рішення не закривати небо над Україною.
And also, the American Secretary of State Antony Blinken doubled down on NATO's refusal of Ukraine's request, saying that it is their responsibility to ensure that war doesn't spill over and beyond the Ukrainian borders.
One of the responsibilities we have, even as we are doing everything we can to give the Ukrainian people the means to defend themselves effectively against Russia, we also have a responsibility, as the Secretary General said, to ensure that the war doesn't spill over even beyond Ukraine. The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes, and that could lead to a full-fledged war.
All right, now to give us more insights in terms of how this war in Ukraine is progressing and what are the options that Ukraine and the West realistically has, we're joined in by Mr. Leston Munson, who is a senior fellow of the National Security Institute, and he's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Munson, let me begin by asking you this. In terms of how the war is going, Russia, although its progress has been slow, it is steadily moving forward in terms of how it is carrying out its military operations. And in this context, the Ukrainian president has been demanding for a no-fly zone to be imposed by the West on Ukraine. Is this even realistically possible?
Well, it is possible, of course. And I think if NATO took the decision to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, they would prevail in that matter. But Secretary Blinken is entirely correct in that if that were to occur, that would mean direct fighting between NATO forces, presumably including Americans, and Russian forces. And President Biden has drawn the line at Americans fighting against Russians in this conflict. So something for which, by the way, I think he has complete political support from the American people.
Well, of time, in terms of how the war is going, is there something more that the West could realistically do? Because the more time passes and the more Russia starts to tighten the screws, the window to try and get some kind of military aid is also shortening.
That's true. And I think the West can provide more military aid for Ukrainians. We can also provide more humanitarian assistance. We've seen the refugee numbers tick up quite high. It's well over 1 million now by official counts, probably many more on unofficial accounts. So aid for those refugees is going to become more important. Also, humanitarian assistance to the people left inside of Ukraine will become very important. And I do think there is still an opportunity here for Ukraine and its friends to continue to have the edge on the Russians here. The longer this goes on, the more difficult it will become for Russia to achieve its goals.
But if you look at the Russian strategy, it appears that Russia is trying to systematically take down the critical infrastructure inside of Ukraine. It is, it's in many ways, it has been targeting the Ukrainian air bases. It's also been looking at the nuclear power plants. In terms of what Russia did yesterday, it has taken over the largest nuclear power plant facility that supplies almost 25% of power to Ukraine. With that being the case, what can Ukraine realistically do in this scenario where the possibility or rather even the capacity of Ukraine to fight back against the Russians is being limited?
Well, we're at the early phase of this. Unfortunately, we're only at the early phase of this conflict. And under the current circumstances, Russia in many ways has the advantage. It does have many more military resources than Ukraine does. However, at the end of the day, Ukraine is an enormous country with a huge population. It is going to be extraordinarily difficult, in fact, nearly impossible for Russia to hold that kind of territory against that size of population. The counterinsurgency operations alone vastly exceed the capabilities of the Russian military. So while they will be able to invade and take strategic targets, it is totally unclear that they will be able to hold those targets and Ukraine as a whole going forward. So the longer this initial phase takes, really the more the advantage shifts to Ukraine in the long run. Yes, there's going to be a lot of destruction and horror in the meantime, and we can't ignore that. But the Ukrainian people, the fight they have shown, the very likely insurgency they are going to launch later on in this conflict does not bode well for Russia.
You know, that's an interesting point that you make, the insurgency that the Ukrainian people will mount in case the Russians prevail in the conventional war. But do you think, is that the reason why, despite the fact that the Russians have managed to muster a convoy, a military convoy that is said to be 40 miles long, it is camping at the gates of Kiev and is not moving in? Because the Russians know that in case they would move their military into Kiev and take over, they would then be fighting an insurgency, and that will be a completely different thing altogether.
Well, I think that's part of it. It is also very clear that the Russian strategy and the tactics have not been up to snuff thus far, and their expectations about how this conflict would go were very different than the reality. So there have been a number of mistakes Russia has made. They're presumably going to learn from those mistakes and make adjustments. And again, at the end of the day, Russia does have vastly more military resources for this conventional phase of the conflict, as you accurately termed it, much more so than Ukraine does. But as this conflict shifts away from the conventional aspects of it and more towards guerrilla warfare, insurgency and counterinsurgency, the advantage will change to Ukraine.
Absolutely. And my last question to you is, at this point of time, the West has stuck to its guns in terms of imposing financial costs. It is sticking to its strategy of putting financial sanctions on Russia. But is that having any impact on Vladimir Putin in the way that he's used his war machine?
It does not appear that it has. However, the sanctions appear to have had a very severe impact on the Russian economy. We've seen all kinds of indicators plunging, the value of the ruble, the value of their markets, the overall economic activity of Russia is plunging. At some point, that is going to impact his ability to rule Russia. It is very clear that he does not have broad support inside Russia for these activities. And the pain of these sanctions is only going to add to that lack of support.
Mr. Munson, thank you very much indeed for joining us and getting us all those insights there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.